In this interactive video, we're going to just touch upon Immanuel Kant's synthesis of rationalism and empiricism. And just so that you know, Kant is a notoriously difficult thinker, prolific and difficult, but he's one of the most important philosophers in the history of philosophy and was a monumental figure that we'd be remiss if we didn't discuss. It's just to discuss rationalism versus empiricism and not look at how Immanuel Kant decided to take the both of each and combine them. And the way that he did it is, to me, critical in understanding the movement of thought over time. But again, I understand this is challenging material, and it's also why I don't ask you to read any like original Kant. The reading on this is a secondary source that puts everything in much plainer language, and hopefully I can do that for you here as well. So, Immanuel Kant lived from 1724 to 1804. He was a German philosopher and Central Enlightenment thinker. He developed the philosophical doctrine known as Transcendental Idealism. And the goal of Transcendental Idealism, or it's also known as just Transcendental Philosophy in general, is to investigate the necessary conditions for knowledge with an eye towards showing that some of those necessary conditions are a priori. Some of them are prior to experience, independent of sense data and experience, and kind of built into us, like a rationalist might say, right? And to show that, some of those necessary conditions are universal and necessary features of our knowledge, and they derive from the mind's own ways of dealing with the data of the senses. And that essentially every living creature has its own way of coping with data from the senses, and we do too, innate structures of mind. But he's going to try to combine this with empiricism so you get the best of both worlds, right? The best of the rationalist, the best of the empiricist. This was his project in the critique of pure reason. So it was David Hume who, quote unquote, awoke Kant from his dogmatic slumber, or just a fancy Enlightenment era way of saying stubborn sleep, right? That he was essentially walking around the world like, I know this about the mind and knowledge, and I'm not even going to question it. It's just a given. So Hume woke him up, Kant said, and he sought to bridge or to synthesize the rationalist and empiricist traditions in epistemology. And once again, he did so in response to the ultimate skepticism of David Hume, the empiricism slash skepticism of David Hume, who awoken him from his dogmatic slumbers. You can tell I like to say that, and it's one of those things that has stuck with me since my undergraduate years. So here's a quick reminder from Descartes, because if Kant's going to synthesize the rationalist empiricists, we need to remind ourselves of those central ideas. Descartes said, "Among my ideas, some appear to be innate. They are part of our rational nature. We are born with them." So again, our ideas of God, the mind itself, and material bodies are all innate ideas or even principles, according to Descartes. And then a little bit of a longer Hume reminder. So for Hume, our resident empiricist, um, Everything that shows up in our brains, mentally speaking, starts with sense impressions. There's no such thing as these innate ideas. We come with nothing, pre-equipped with nothing, no software, in other words. Um, these sense impressions become mental representations, or what Hume called ideas. Right? So I know that the word ideas can sound like, hey, I've got a great idea. Let's go do this, and after that, we'll do that, like a plan. But for Hume, an idea just meant anything that shows up in your brain. So I could be looking at um, at the dog leash on the table actively, right? And I'm looking at it. It's coming through my eyes. I'm touching it. It's coming through my sense of touch. And so I'm having active sense impressions right now. Now, if I close my eyes and take my hand off the leash, I can imagine or picture the leash in my hand and imagine the feeling and imagine what it looks like, right? Like a mental representation of the leash. Hume would call that an idea. Mm. So, all legitimate knowledge for Hume, the empiricist, that we have must be traceable back to sense impressions, or you got to get rid of them, he said, or it's baloney. So, if you have any bit of quote unquote knowledge about the world that you think is true, then better be able to, in some way, trace it back to an initial sense impression. You got to take that idea, that piece of knowledge that you think you have, and essentially do some mental archaeology on it. Dig and dig and dig until you can find the sense impression at the bottom of it that can justify it. If you can't find that, if it can't be traced back to some sort of impression made upon your senses in the empirical outside world, then you got to get rid of it because um, it's it's fanciful. Mm. So this means that legitimate knowledge for Hume comes in only two sorts: what he called relations of ideas and matters of fact. So for Hume, here's what we can know for certain, right? Essentially, relations of ideas. So for a relation of ideas, they have these qualities. Their negation leads to a self contradiction. So if we were to say, so an example, all triangles have three sides is a relation of ideas. Now, if you negate it, you are going to be self contradictory. If you said it's not the case that all triangles have three sides, then that's just inherently contradictory. So that's how you know you're dealing with the relation of ideas. They are a priori or independent of experience, simply meaning that, again, in order to verify or falsify the claim, you don't have to go and do experiments on the world. Right? I can close my eyes and ears and put myself in a hermetically sealed room and say, I know it is true that all triangles have three sides simply by reflecting upon the meaning of triangle and three-sidedness, right? Independent of experience is what they would say, a priori. They are true by definition, as we've already stated, right? By definition, a triangle has three sides, and therefore they are necessarily true or must be true. So those are relations of ideas for Hume. Kant relabeled this category analytic. So just kind of put a pin in that and remember it for the future. So instead of relations of ideas, Kant read Hume and then said, we're going to call these sorts of claims, knowledge claims, analytic claims. Then for Hume, there were matters of fact. That sounds as if it's just saying, hey, it's a matter of fact that a triangle has three sides. Like this is just a quirk of the language from back then. He is really just saying claims about the world that you need to uh, use your senses on. That's what he really meant by matters of fact. Um, for those, their negation does not lead to a contradiction, not an inherent contradiction. So to go back to the coffee cup, husband's coffee cup example, if I were to say, make the claim, my husband's coffee cup is empty. If I negate that, if I say it is not the case that my husband's coffee cup is empty, that's not inherently contradictory, right? Remember, if you say it's not the case that all triangles have three sides, that's inherently contradictory. If I say it's not the case that my husband's coffee cup is empty, that's not inherently contradictory. It's dependent upon what is actually the case out in the world. So in that sense, these sorts of claims about the world, what Hume called matters of fact, are a posteriori. You can only tell whether they are true or false, not by reflecting on the meaning of terms, but by going and checking, by using your senses and experiencing what is actually the case. You got to go over and check the cup. Right? Again, also, these sorts of claims are not true by definition. Right? There's nothing about the claim, my husband's coffee cup is empty. There's nothing, my husband's coffee cup, part of the definition of my husband's coffee cup is not emptiness or fullness. This is not a definitional claim, right? And therefore, when these sorts of claims are true, they're only contingently true. They're not necessarily true. So again, just for as an example, I know this gets a little tedious, but just bear with me here. All triangles have three sides is necessarily true because a triangle by definition is a three-sided figure, right? My husband's coffee cup is empty. If I make that claim about the world, I then have to go check the cup and see. And if it is indeed empty, then it's true. If it's full, then the claim was false. That's what it means to be contingently true. It's contingent upon what is actually the case out there in the world, not upon definitions. Well, Kant read this distinction and relabeled this category of claims about the world or knowledge claims synthetic, meaning to synthesize stuff. That doesn't mean fake in this sense. Synthetic, it means you're taking one thing and saying something else about it that adds to the subject, like the predicate, what you're saying about the subject, they don't contain one another. Right? I'm saying this about my husband's coffee cup, it's empty. I'm adding something, I'm synthesizing two different things. So, Hume said, when we run over after he lays this down, this is something called Hume's fork. This distinction between, I'm backing up a little bit, sorry, but the distinction between relations of ideas and matters of fact is known as Hume's fork. He didn't call it that. He didn't say, I have just established these categories of knowledge and therefore it's called Hume's fork. We named it that in retrospect, right? There are only two prongs to Hume's fork. And I'll show you how that works. When we run over libraries, he said, persuaded of these principles, namely of that there are just two kinds of knowledge, relations of ideas and matters of fact, what havoc must we make if we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics? Let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning or concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact or existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, he said, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. And what the heck does all of this mean? He's essentially saying, I just convinced you there's only two types of knowledge claims. Right? One, relations of ideas, one, matters of fact. Take this fork and take any claim about the world, any sort of quote unquote knowledge claim. If it can't be picked up as a relation of ideas or as a matter of fact that can be empirically falsified or justified with the senses, you gotta ditch it. Because, or is it not just ditch it, but burn it, because it's just BS, he said. So now think about the sort of things that don't make the cut. God exists is a knowledge claim about the world. There is such a thing as God. Or let's go back to God exists. Is that inherently analytic? No. Can you trace it back to the senses? Technically, no. None of us have directly experienced God, and that's a criteria for Hume. So claims like God exists, you have to burn it, he would say. Human beings have free will. That is not a relation of ideas. It's not true by definition. And the possession of free will is not empirically verifiable or falsifiable. So claims like that are gone too. We have a soul, not a relation of ideas, not a matter of fact that's traceable to sense impressions. Gone. See what goes, what has to be committed to the flames as a result of Hume's program. All sorts of things we believe about the world and ourselves and the universe, or many of us believe these things. Certainly, the majority of people believe these things back in Hume's day. He's essentially coming out and saying all that's got to be burned because they're not genuine knowledge claims. We can't know those things. That's Hume's fork. And Hume's fork led to what is today known as the problem of induction. And the problem of induction concerns the support or justification of inductive methods, methods that predict or infer, in Hume's words, that instances of which we have had no direct experience resemble those of which we have had direct experience. And these sort of methods are essential in scientific reasoning as well as in the conduct of our everyday affairs. If you reflect on the way that you think, just in your everyday affairs, on the way that you think, we make predictions constantly in order to take action in the world, in order to make inferences and judgments about the world, arguments about the world. We predict certain things. We say, you know what? I know this is going to happen tomorrow because it's been happening every day up to now, even if you don't say that aloud, right? So imagine that you have a puppy and it's peed on the rug for 2 weeks straight since you got it. The next day when you wake up, it's not that you make this explicit to yourself, but it becomes part of your quote unquote knowledge. This puppy's most likely going to pee on the rug today. How do you know? Because it's peed on the rug every day for 2 weeks. It's a really important part of our thinking. And think about how indispensable predictions are to science. And again, when I say prediction, we're not talking about like some sort of psychic with a crystal ball. I'm talking about predictive thinking in the scientific sense. Indispensable in scientific reasoning. So the problem is how to support or justify these sorts of claims. And this leads to a dilemma, right? The principle that the future will resemble the past can't be proved deductively because it's contingent, right? It's not true by definition. Hey, the future will resemble the past. That is not a relation of ideas. Doesn't make it on that prong of Hume's fork, right? Only necessary truths can be proved deductively. And it can't be supported inductively by arguing that it's always or usually been reliable in the past, because it would beg the question by assuming just what is to be proved. Now, what he means by this is, if take the knowledge claim, the future will resemble the past, right? How can you possibly know that this is true unless you use that in your argument? Um, let's say your conclusion is, therefore, the future will resemble the past. How would you justify it? What premise would you use to support that conclusion? The only one you could is you could say, well, the future has always resembled the past in the past. Therefore, the future will resemble the past. That's known as circular reasoning, also known as begging the question. So it's a weak argument. This is the problem of induction's a little complex, and there are supplemental videos on it if you'd like to look, but we're just following the train of thought here. Now, in a philosophical sense, Hume left us with a philosophical desert, right? If you consistently and vigorously follow his program of empiricism to its logical conclusion, he brought a disaster into the philosophical enterprise. Remember, we're still warming up for Kant here, but in order to understand Kant, we have to remember these things, since it was, after all, and once again, Hume who woke Kant up. Hume brought a disaster into the philosophical enterprise, right? And the sphere of certainty was reduced to verbal truths and descriptions of sense data. But everything that interested people fell beyond those limits. All the cool stuff of philosophy, like, do we have a soul? What's the nature of that soul? What's the nature of consciousness? What is the mind-body connection, if there is one? Do we have free will? Does God exist? All of these cool, quote unquote, metaphysical, philosophical questions were burnt up with Hume's fork. So this is what woke Kant up. Oh, by the way, and after Hume delivered this complex argument about what needs to be thrown away or burnt up, um, in terms of knowledge, he just said, "Whoop, see, I just handed it to you, and there's no need to do any of that cool philosophy anymore, because I just argued very cogently on behalf of my empiricist program, and maybe we should all just go back to tending sheep." So that's just him being witty and a little smug. Now, enter Kant, who very famously, in philosophy at least, said, let me reflect on the rationalist, let me reflect on the empiricist, the pluses of both of them, and to begin, let's say this: thoughts without content are empty, and intuitions without concepts are blind. Let me translate into more modern parlance here. Like, principles of thinking without sense data are empty. You can't just walk around with a bunch of principles of thought, like, hey, all events are caused, and have nothing to back it up, like no real sense data or content there. It's an empty category of thinking. And intuitions, or just a bunch of sense impressions and sense data, is what he means here, without structure, without principles, are blind. Right? So you can't just walk around with principles of thought with no content to fill up these principles. Those are empty. And you can't just walk around with a brain full of just random, unconnected sense data without some sort of principles of organization to corral them. Those are just blind. So he's saying, look, we got to split the difference somewhere. We have to combine the rationalist and the empiricist programs in a way that synthesizes the two and salvages the best that each have to offer, because it's not one or the other. So essentially Descartes plus Hume equals Kant. And here's a rundown of Kant's epistemology, and I'm going to cover a lot of just basic concepts that help make sense of Kant. But remember, like I said, this is really challenging, and it's stuff, and it's okay if some of it's lost on you, and you can certainly ask me if you're interested. But Kant held that it is true that all knowledge begins with experience. That's true. Like the empiricist said, without experience, no knowledge takes place. So experience is like the initiator, the instigator of coming to possess knowledge. So in this sense, he agrees with Hume and the empiricists. But Kant also held that it's not true that all knowledge arises from experience. So experience is not the sole source of knowledge. Contra the empiricists, against the empiricists, he said this. There must also be these categories or principles by which we experience, by which our very experience of the world is structured or understood for there to be knowledge. So here he agrees with Descartes and the rationalists. Let me introduce a few of Kant's epistemological distinctions, and just bear with me here. So he borrowed some and created some. So for Kant, again, and this is review, a priori means something known prior to and independently of experience. Again, so I'll give you examples in a minute. Let me run these down. Then there's a posteriori, which is something known from experience or sense data, as a result of experience and sense data. Then there's the analytic, and that's where the predicate of the knowledge claim is contained in the concept of the subject. In a sense, the claim is definitional. And then there is synthetic, and that's where the predicate adds something new to the concept of the subject. Now, let's take a look at some examples here where he's combining these. And he does this in the book. I mean, it's brilliant and tedious and challenging at the same time. And it certainly is monumental in the history of philosophy, but that's why we're going over it. But just bear with us. So Kant starts to combine these. He said, there is an analytic a priori, and an example of which he said, all triangles have three sides. Same example we've been using throughout. Then, if you combine analytic and a posteriori, there's no such thing. You can't have something that is where the predicate that is definitional, but is a result of experience, he said. There's no such knowledge claim as that. But there is such a thing as a synthetic a posteriori, he said, like my husband's coffee cup is empty. Synthetic in the sense that emptiness, the predicate is adding something to the concept of the coffee cup. And you can only know whether or not this is true as a result of experience, going and checking, right? And he said, now there's another kind of knowledge, this is the controversial one, known as the synthetic a priori, which is saying that the predicate adds something new to the concept of the subject, yet this knowledge claim is known prior to and independently of experience. This was his big move. An example of the synthetic a priori for Kant is all events are caused, for instance. Now, and hopefully all of this will tie together. That was my intention. But another set of concepts that we need to understand before we see the payoff here, hopefully, is Kant's distinction between the phenomenal and the noumenal worlds. So Kant contended that the mind is active in the knowing process. And you might be like, well, yeah, of course, I can know something if your mind's not active. But what he means by that is that the mind actually helps build the world that we think we live in, the world that we inhabit. The mind is largely responsible for the world that we think we occupy every day. So the mind makes an active contribution to the constitution of the objective world. When you look out in the world, look into your kitchen, you look into your living room, you look at your dog, you look at your coffee, right? And in the natural state of existence, it just seems like, look, that's the world. It's out there for me. This coffee cup is on the table. Kitchen is right there. Everything is as it seems. That's kind of like the natural attitude that we go through the world with. What Kant is saying is that our minds actually stitch all this together. Things aren't exactly the way they seem. Our minds are building up these worlds. So where I'm saying to myself, look, there's the kitchen, there's the coffee cup, there's the dog, none of that could really look the way it does if it wasn't for what our minds are bringing to the table. And one way to kind of understand this is that if I, the way that the coffee cup looks to me, the red color of the coffee cup, when my dog looks at that coffee cup, doesn't look the same at all. Dogs can't see red as I understand it. So we have no idea what the world looks like from a dog's eyes. We know certain things that we have in common with them, but the world is a very different looking place to a dog than it is to a human, let alone something like a crow, which can see, which can see some ridiculous number of colors that we can't even conjure up in our minds, right? So what Kant is saying is that this world that we look around and think we see, our minds building it up. There's something out there that's causing a sensation, and then whatever we think we perceive, our minds are largely responsible for the way things appear to us. And it's not necessarily the way that things are in themselves. So Kant called this objective world outside of our minds, whatever it is that's causing these sensations and this world building activity in our minds. He called this the noumenal world, the world as it is in itself. See, I'm putting the cursor over here like, there's some stuff out there that's causing sensations in us that are run through our minds that then generate the world as it appears to us. The world as it appears to us, he called the phenomenal world. So, noumenal world is whatever it is out there that's causing these sensations and reactions in our brains, in our minds. Noumenal. The world, when we just look around it naturally, like, oh, there's kitchen, there's dog, the way the world appears to us, he called the phenomenal world, or subjective worlds. So the phenomenal world is the world we're aware of, and it's the world we construct out of the sensations that are present to our consciousness. The noumenal world, once again, consists of things we seem compelled to believe in, like stuff outside of ourselves, but we can't actually ever really know it because we lack sense evidence of it. All we know is something's operating on the senses. We don't know the nature of it out there, he would argue. I know it's trippy. So here's Kant's schema. I'm going to use, this is an updated, this part here uses his language. This part to the right is more of an updated. It's like this. Imagine that outside of our minds, the outside of quote unquote objective world, there's just like raw material, sensory raw material that hits our senses. He says it's run through what's known as our faculty of sensibility, the very conditions of us being able to sense anything at all, beyond just the eyes, nose, ears, and mouth and such. It goes into the mind, what he called the forms of intuition of space and time, right? Raw material gets organized in time and space, which he's going to say we don't know that those really exist outside of the mind, he's going to say. But humans have to organize raw sensory material in terms of time and space to even begin to start making any more sense of it. So raw material hits our our temporal and spatial organization in our minds, then gets run through what he calls the faculties or categories of understanding, gets run through categorical operations, and then through our faculty of reason, we apply principles, we make inferences. So it goes from raw data through the forms of what he called intuition, space and time, run through the categories of understanding and the faculty of reason to generate this quote unquote phenomenal world. So it goes from noumena through our minds, through all this stuff that he says we come pre-equipped with, to phenomenal. And the categories of understanding are how we understand this raw data. We understand it in terms of quantity, like unity, plurality, totality. We understand the raw data in terms of quality, like reality, negation, limitation. We understand the raw data in terms of relation, like a substance, causality, reciprocity. And we understand the raw data in terms of modality, which is like possibility, actuality, necessity. So it's almost kind of like sometimes I picture like a sausage maker, right? You get the raw, just the meat from the outside noumenal world. It's run through the sausage maker in our brains, and then out comes the sausage. I know it's a little bit gross, but if we're going with that analogy, consider the hunk of meat is like the noumenal world, and the sausage is the phenomenal world, the everyday world that we occupy. So then I made these diagrams to see if these will clarify or just make everything a little bit more clear. So for Descartes, the ultimate rationalist, he says, look, there's a flower out there. It's run through these innate ideas of God and mind and material bodies to bring us to this mental, this conclusion, right? This mental notion of this is a daisy. So this is most critical. Some stuff out here that's a flower, sense data, hits these innate ideas for Descartes, and then we generate, okay, this is a daisy. For Hume, there's a daisy out there. There's sense data. It hits the brain. It doesn't get run through any categories of the understanding. Remember, for Hume, we're a tabula rasa. This thing's blank first. So this hits this, becomes a sense impression, right? Which becomes an idea, which becomes an inference. This is a daisy. No machinations there. For Kant, it becomes a little bit more complex. From the noumenal world, there's some raw sense data. We don't know what the heck it is, but it's raw sense data. There's a faint daisy there to kind of make the point. This noumenal raw sense data hits the mind, gets run through the forms of intuition, which are space and time, run through the categories of understanding in order to generate the everyday world, which is called the phenomenal world, right? And generate, okay, here's a daisy in the everyday life. So it required the raw sense data plus these innate categories in order to get the phenomenal world down here and to eventually say this is a daisy. Hopefully this graphic, although it's loose, right? This kind of stuff is hard to depict. Hopefully this made a little bit more sense. So then here's the roundup. Here's the payoff of what Kant was doing. With Descartes' rationalism, you could have God, you could have the soul, free will, morality, because in his discourse on method, he deductively proved the existence of all of these things. You could have these other metaphysical concepts, but it required some really questionable logical maneuvers, and it denigrated the status of observation and experimentation, and hence science. Remember that Descartes was one said sensory data can be doubted. Deductive reasoning can't. Basic the fact that I'm thinking can't, right? So you get all this stuff with Descartes' rationalism at the expense of observation and experimentation. With Hume's empiricism, you could have observation, experimentation, and science, but you lose God. You lose the soul, you lose the self, free will, morality, all of these things go out the window. They don't fit on Hume's fork. Kant's system and his notion of the synthetic a priori made room for both. And it was a Copernican revolution in philosophy. If you remember, Copernicus is the one who said it's the sun that's the center of the um, solar system, or our system, not the Earth. Well, Kant's work put human beings at the center of world generations and not the other way around. It wasn't, hey, there's a world outside that our minds conform to. He was saying that our minds build the very worlds that we're talking about. That's why they called it a Copernican revolution in philosophy. And the subject doing the knowing constitutes or builds to a considerable extent the object. So, in other words, knowledge is in part constituted by a priori or transcendental factors, which are contributed by the mind itself, which the mind imposes upon the data of experience. So that's that, and hopefully this made a little bit of sense, and at bare minimum, I was able to explain how Kant tries to split the difference between rationalism and empiricism, making room for both and compromising where necessary. And um, that's that.